Well, it's a great privilege to be here, and I'll just make sure I know how to use this. Yes, it looks like it's straightforward. And to come all the way from Australia to, obviously, to be in Finland and see the incredible architecture that's around here. So my presentation is really talking about one particular building. It's finished in 2006. The reason I think it's of interest is, obviously, it talks about glass, but more than that, it's that it talks about how, as architects, we try to solve problems, and this talks about 3 different issues that we were trying to solve from a design perspective, and how we worked with BG&E in particular, and with a range of different consultants and contractors to try to solve these issues. So the project's 171 Collins Street, and it's really a 3-part story that I'll go through. And as I said, started in 2006, finished in 2013, so quite a long project for us to deal with. For those that aren't familiar with Melbourne, the project's located in the centre of Melbourne, in the Hoddle Grid. Hoddle Grid's shown in red up here, and the 2 streets that are of interest is Collins Street, which is Melbourne's premier street, and then in addition to that, there's the Shrine Axis, which runs north-south, and that's Swanston Street. So zooming into that area, you'll see 2 buildings here, 171 to the upper right, and then St Pauls Cathedral. And it's this relationship with St Pauls Cathedral which is instrumental for this project. The building itself, just to get the pragmatics out of the way, is quite a small commercial building, a boutique skyscraper in Melbourne. It's only 18 stories tall. There's floor plates for around 1,800 square metres. The rear of the building's 80 metres tall. And then there's a heritage building at the front, which is 8 levels, designed in 1918, which is old for Australia, and by Naram Barnett. And it's separated by an atrium. So the 3 parts that I'll be talking to are really the tower, then I'll move on to the podium strategy, and then finally the atrium. So this is a view from the shrine, which is a war memorial in Melbourne, and it's a really key set-out point for the city of Melbourne. And we're looking north, and the building's shown in white in this slide, and you've got St Paul's Cathedral just to the left of that. What you'll notice about Melbourne, it's got 2 hills, and on the 2 hills is where all the tall buildings are located, and then you move into a much shallower valley through the centre of the city, which is illustrated in this diagram. And this centre part of the city is a 40-metre height limit, and it's the retail core of the city of Melbourne. On the left, we've got the planning controls. So the first thing that happens with us is a client comes to us and says they want to maximise their site and the opportunity they've got. This particular site had a discretionary 40-metre height rather than a mandatory 40-metre height. And so what we had to do was to find out how we could actually maximise that site for our client. And so we looked at what the planning control was telling us, and the planning control said that St Paul's Cathedral had to remain the most dominant building on the entry into Melbourne from the south. And our analysis, walking up and down the river and looking at this at St Paul's Cathedral, was it certainly was no longer the most dominant building from the south. And what we'd found was that because the cathedral is built in the valley, which is not at all normal, mostly cathedrals are built on the hills, the city of Melbourne had grown up around it, and the spires which you normally read against the skyline had been disturbed by these masonry and other darker glass buildings in the backdrop, as can be illustrated in this slide. So we spoke to the State Department and planners and said, what if we built an artificial backdrop to these spires? What if we brought the sky down and basically allowed the silhouette of the spires to be read strongly again? And to the credit, the planner said, yes, we'll absolutely give you the opportunity to do this, but your building has to be of a very high architectural standard, and we'll actually follow your process all the way through the planning period. It took us quite a few years to get this planning permit through. So our approach was to look at the building as a jewel in the city. We didn't want one large monolith. What we wanted to do was to actually make this building as elegant as possible. The proportions of the building were quite unfortunate. It's basically 30 metres wide by 60 metres long and only 80 metres tall. So it's quite a stumpy building. So what we were seeking to do was to change its visual aspect ratio, and we did that by breaking the building into ribbons. So it's a series of 6 metre wide ribbons, and then we canted the building in and out so that as the sun moved around the building, we got this glistening effect off the project. So here's an early study model which shows the building canting out, which is 1.5 degrees over the tidal boundary, and then it comes back in. So the client didn't lose any area out of this design approach, but what we got was a shaping of the building. The next thing that was important was to allow for the spires to be read clearly. We wanted a continuous surface. We wanted to remove the idea of the spandrel being read, and so these images on the right show this configuration of a church with a backdrop, but the spandrels are so powerful that they almost read more dominantly than the building itself. So we wanted this continuous surface. And we wanted the surface to be as light and bright as possible to take on the condition of the sky. As we know, glazing, as the light comes through, basically it absorbs the light and doesn't bounce it back into your eyes, making the building darker. And then also if you start applying body tints and so on, the idea of it being more like an artificial sky was lost. So we did study body tints and discarded them. And then we looked at the idea of applying a white ceramic frit over the whole building. And the reason for the ceramic frit was back at this stage, we also looked at digital prints and so on, so in terms of getting accuracy, but the digital prints, the ink at that stage wasn't opaque enough. And when you put it up to the light, they ended up glowing like a large diffuser. So that took us to basically ceramic frits. And basically, we only could do a single pass at that stage. We couldn't do double passes. And so we did a lot of investigation about different options in terms of getting the lightness and brightness for this building. So this is going back to, obviously, 2006. We ended up using a mesh pattern rather than a dot pattern. We looked at both. We found that the eye tends to try to make patterns out of the dots more so than with a mesh pattern. We then, at the time, we hired a group called Luminova. Our computing power back then, bizarrely, wasn't powerful enough to actually map this mesh across the whole surface and actually put all the qualities of the glass into the model. So we applied a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, all the way up to 100. Obviously, 100% frit means you can't see out the building, so not that great for tenants. And then working with our client, tried to tune the building that provided enough of the brightness that we're after, along with the opportunity for vision from the inside. So what we settled on from a planning perspective was a 40% frit with a 20% reflective coating, which is the maximum you can do in Melbourne, and a range of other configurations which I won't go into. So having got that through planning, the next issue you have in Australia anyway is that you need to attract an anchor tenant. So we needed someone to move into this building, and the commercial market's highly competitive. And so we were up against other buildings, and we know that the other buildings' agents were saying that our building wouldn't be fantastic for them to move into because we had a ceramic frit over the vision panel. So what we wanted to do was to prove to future tenants that there was actually a high quality within this building and the vision out was going to be fine. So we ended up building this prototype, and we applied basically 2 different frits across the 4 panels and then a range of different coatings. So we'll zoom in, but what you can see here is quite a difference in colour range between these. These are all 40% ceramic frit, and as we zoom in, what the configurations of each one of these is quite different. So the 2 on the left have both got a white ceramic frit. The 2 on the right have a grey ceramic frit. Now what we were trying to do with that was that we thought that the white frit on the inside, because we only could do a single pass, it meant that the inside of the glass was going to be have a white frit. And we were worried about the brightness of that and the lack of ability to see through the glass. So we basically tried a silver, thinking that silver was closest to dark, to a black, which would give you the best vision through. And then in this, basically in the first option with the white, we then put a grey interlayer in. The idea again was to knock the whiteness back. And then we also tried that again with the silver with panel 3. Panel 2 basically had no interlayer on it whatsoever. And then with these panels, we were also trying laminated glass to allow for the frit to get to the edge with no edge deletion, and then also to use yeah, so laminate versus a monolithic where you had a bigger joint being red. We also wanted full height glass, but we wanted to show to the client what the issue was if we had basically broke the glass at the ceiling line rather than at the floor to floor height. Then having set that all up, we then were concerned about mesh, basically the drop-down blinds and the idea of a moire effect between two mesh patterns. And thankfully there wasn't that issue in this instance. And then there was a raft of photos that we spent over 6 months photographing this under different conditions. So an overcast sky condition, direct sunlight, and then indirect sunlight. And what we found to our great surprise was the glass that actually looked the best externally actually performed the best internally. And we're not quite sure why this is, but panel 2 gave us the greatest clarity of vision, both perpendicular to the glass, but also on an acute angle. And so that gave us great confidence to move forward. And so what we ended up doing was advising the client of basically out of this prototype, which was purely a design prototype, so it wasn't for performance issues at all. It was really allowing us to tune the building, was to select a range of different things. We managed to use the narrower joint, which is obviously more expensive, having a laminated glass over the whole building. We had floor-to-ceiling glass, floor-to-floor glass with no break, so basically a blind transom. And then we had this, the coating with the white frit with no interlayer. This is the building being constructed, a render, and then the reality from my phone back in the day. And these are more professional photos. And so what you can see is these sandstone spires really stand out in relationship to the backdrop, and whether it's an overcast sky, a clear sky, or a sunset, the building takes on the characteristics of the skyline. And that's the heritage building in front by Naram Barnett. So the next part of the story is really the podium. Podiums in Australia, really from the 70s, really had this idea of being 40 metres high in the city of Melbourne, 10 metres setback, and then the tower form sitting on top. We had an issue with that in terms of being architects, that you were disassociated with the building on the skyline. So you'd see this tower, but when you walked around the base of the building, you'd have no idea that this building belonged to that particular skyline image that you had in your head. So what we wanted to do was bring the tower to the ground in one part only. And so the southwest corner of the building comes all the way and meets the ground. And then we have this podium element to the side. The podium element addresses Flinders Lane. And Flinders Lane used to be where a lot of the goods were made. So the goods were made in the laneways and sold on the main streets. And what was interesting about the laneways was the strong vertical language of this laneway. And then with the stone, as you come down towards a more pedestrian level, there was a secondary layer, this rustication of the stonework. So more texture as you move through the streetscape. The Naram Barnett project on the Collins Street face was also interesting in terms of how it came down. Its load path at the very bottom ended up slipping and then splitting on either side, and not through columns, actually just through a large lintel. So we're interested in this idea of a shifting load path. This is looking at the site from the rear, so this is the Flinders Lane site, with the Richard Allen building next to it, which was broken into the base, middle and top tripartite. And so we struck those lines across, and what's shown in red is the 60s buildings that we were going to demolish. An early sketch. And what we were trying to do with this particular component of the design was to tie it into the basically a 19th century model, which is the masonry model here, where you've got punched openings. So the glazing's pushed back about half a metre. You've got the rustication, so the stonework horizontal, and then very strong verticals. And so we've done that again with this building. We've taken the cornice lines across, so the base, middle and top, slipped the forms across, and then through glass and steel reinterpreted basically a 19th century construction model. So this was study models, an early render. And then we went through and As architects, we're desperately trying to source glass and get ideas before we really know what we're doing. So we relied heavily on BG&E to get a range of different glass types in. And of particular note for the podium was this idea of this routed glass. The routed glass was meant to take on the characteristics of the stonework, which had been had this masonry component etched into it. And then probably a year later, we managed to get into obviously the prototypes. This might even be 2 years later. And with that, so we've got this glass which is set back 1/2 metre, the V-groove glass to the front, and then to the back of that shadow box, we've got a mirror. So very bright mirror. And the idea behind that, again, this was quite controversial. People were worried about that cars might crash because of the brightness of the reflection. But what we were trying to do was get as much amplification out of that routed line as possible with light coming through and bouncing off it. There was no issue with cars, by the way. And this is it being constructed. And then straight after completion. And this setback of the glass also allowed us to hide louvers. So where the glass is pushed back, we're in a very tight laneway, so you don't really get square onto the building. It meant that we could put our whole mechanical plant louvers concealed across that. We had a plenum behind, so we could redirect the air around and put the louvers where we wanted to so that the louvers didn't impact on the architectural expression of the building. So you can see some of the louvers just above the V-groove glass here, but they're pushed back 1/2 metre. And then this is once the restaurant went into the bottom corner, so with a bit more life in it. But you can see the glistening of the glass there with the V-groove. And then finally, the atrium. So the atrium had its own conundrum. Basically, it was set within 4 different conditions. To the north of it, there was the heritage building, the Naram Burnett building, and that was part of our design. So we wanted those people facing to the south of that heritage building to look into the atrium, so they needed a view into the atrium. The building to the right of us, 161 Collins Street, had windows on its fire-rated wall, which you're technically not allowed to do. But to facilitate basically a planning process and to stop them objecting with us, what we suggested was that we'd keep their windows so their tenants didn't get basically penalised by our building going up. And so we had to maintain their view into our atrium. Then on the left, you've got the Currajong building, which has had a blank wall. And then finally, our own office tower, which also needed to look into that space. So what that meant was that we had this unfortunate situation of different types of windows looking into the atrium, which was meant to be the heart of this premium building. This building was also a 6-star Green Star building. It was the first premium building of its type in Melbourne in over 20 years. So it was a very high benchmark that we're going for. So our approach was to wrap a screen, some sort of veil, around 3 sides of the building, which then, as you moved into the building, you looked up and you saw the tower coming straight through. We did a lot of studies about how this might be designed, and with the tower, we had a 6-storey fold. So every 6 stories, the facade canted out 1.5 degrees, and then it went back in the opposite direction. What we wanted to do in the atrium was to reduce that to a 1-storey pivot. And we looked at a range of different, I guess, artists as well. So Ellsworth Kelly, amongst others. And then we were trying to find a pattern language that would work across this space. And we ended up finding an Arnie Jacobsen fabric, trapeze, which we thought, which is a 2-dimensional pattern, but we straight away started reading this in a 3-dimensional fashion. It was like there was a shadow play already that Jacobsen was doing with this pattern. So we did. We turned this into a 3-dimensional pattern, which became our atrium screen. Set out drawings, trying to figure out how you could get behind it for maintenance and cleaning of the windows and other practicalities. We didn't want a frame around this element, so it's really just top and bottom supported. Study models as well. Models are really important for us to convince clients about how we think a space might perform. They're actually much more effective than we find than renders initially. And then moving into renders. So our next issue was how do we actually get this glazing to work? So what this glazing had to do was it had to allow vision from those basically neighbouring buildings into this atrium space. But then on the entryway, as you looked up, it was meant to look like it was a solid surface. So how can you make a translucent but solid screen at the one time? So we initially thought, well, we could try a completely transparent screen. We could also do 20% reflectance, so up the reflectance of the glass, or we could put a frit over the glass to get this veiling appearance. But each one of these had their own issues. So we were concerned that the transparent screen, no coating, would actually just do nothing. There would be 40 tonnes of glass for no purpose. It would actually just be completely transparent. If we put a coating on it, we were worried that it would turn into a mirror ball and be highly reflective. Or if we put a frit on it, the idea that the frit would end up, we were looking through a tower with already ceramic frit on it, and this idea of a moire effect was a great concern, because then basically this premium tower, no one would want to be within it. So what we did was we were now working with a contractor, and we got them to source a series of different glass types for us, and then to build a jig. So we still had our prototype, and we then put this jig inside the prototype, and again did a whole series of tests to find out what would work and what didn't work. I won't go through all of this in detail, but what was of interest was that the ceramic frit did indeed have a moire effect on it, even between the panels next to one another. So we rapidly discounted that. What we ended up going with is this idea of low iron glass with no additional coating. And we did some modelling of this with, again, with Luminova. We didn't have the computing power to do this at the time. These days it'd be quite easy to do. But and what we were relying on is this idea of basically angle of reflectance. And so the best way of describing this is really that when you go into a lake, let's say, and you go up to your shins and you look down, you're perpendicular to the surface and you can see your feet very clearly. But if you then look across on an oblique angle across that lake, you'll see the reflection of the sky. So what we were hoping to do with this building was that when you went in at the ground floor and you looked up, it'd be a very similar acute angle that you were looking at, and that the glass would appear like a solid surface. So we did a range of different studies through this computer software at the time, and managed to convince our client that this was a great idea. So the builders went around and started building this, and they basically contacted us quite regularly saying that this was not going to work and that they could see straight through the glass. But thankfully at the end, when they dropped the scaffold and looked up, it performed probably even better than we had anticipated. So this is a view looking down, the bracketry details, and then a view looking up. So you can see that you can't see any of the windows behind this. Unfortunately, the skylight had a bit more structure in it than we would have liked, but the general effect we thought was quite powerful. And this is from an office space looking through, so the transparency of the screen. And then down at the lobby level. So this building didn't start out in this way. It wasn't that we were trying to do an essay in glass or anything like that. But as architects, each project has its own idiosyncratic issues that you're trying to deal with. And it's about building a level of trust with your client. So the reason that this started to occur was we doubled the height limit through doing this process. So that's a lot of yield for a client. The city were happy with the outcome as well. The spires read beautifully against the building. And what we'd managed to do was really explore three different, glass technologies. So the idea of applying a ceramic frit to the glass to change the performance and the reading of the building, then going down to the podium, actually manipulating the glass and etching the glass, and then finally at the bottom one with the atrium was simply just using the glass and changing its angle to actually change the way it was appearing. And it was very well received. So you can see that obviously you can't see the spandrels. And this atrium space is really quite beautiful. So thanks for your time. Thanks. Do I go down this way?
Thanks, Tim. Have we got any questions for Tim?
That's good.
I think not, Tim.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. Did you like what you just saw? If you did, why don't you like the video, drop us a comment below, and share the video as well, since GPD is all about sharing. And to receive more videos in future, subscribe to this channel and don't forget to click the bell icon. Ciao!